Welcome everyone to the IAPP web conference, Practical Tips for Building Your Privacy Operations. My name is Jordan Hardy, Programming and Speaker Specialist here at the IAPP, and I'll be your host for today's program. We'll be getting started with the presentation in just a minute, but before we do, a few program details. Participating in today's web conference will automatically provide IAPP certified privacy professionals who are the name registrants with 1 CPE credit. Others who are listening in can apply for those credits through an easy-to-use online form on our website. And I also want to let you know that a recording of this program will be available in your My IAPP, My Purchases, My Recordings portal within about 48 hours. So if you just log into your account and then go to My Purchases and My Recordings, that's where you can see the recording and the slides as well. Now onto our program. I'd like to introduce today's panelists. Please feel free to post any questions you have for the panelists in the Q&A area at the bottom of the screen, and there will be a reserved Q&A portion at the end of the program. First, I'd like to introduce Rick Buck, Chief Privacy Officer at WireWheel. Rick, thanks so much for joining us. Could you tell us a little bit more about your current role and professional experience?
Yeah, thanks for having us today, Jordan. Hi, everybody. I'm Rick Buck. I'm Chief Privacy Officer at WireWheel. I've been in the privacy industry a very long time, dating back to the pre-digital age. And I spent the bulk of my career helping marketers grow, retain, and acquire customers and leverage data in ethical and privacy compliant ways. So, and as the industry has changed, the need for privacy operations has matured, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So thanks for having us.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Next, I'd like to introduce Rebecca Shore, Vice President and Chief Privacy Officer of Albertsons. Rebecca, we're happy to have you as well on the panel today. Could you tell us a little bit more about your current role and professional experience?
Sure. Thank you. I'm Rebecca Shore. I'm the Chief Privacy Officer at Albertsons Companies. I have had well over a decade in the privacy space working in this area. I consider myself an operational privacy attorney. And I previously led Under Armour's privacy program, and I'm now the Chief Privacy Officer at Albertsons, although today I'll be speaking on behalf of myself and not on behalf of the company.
Yes, perfect. Thanks so much. And then last but not least, to round out the program, we have Eric Paulson, Manager of Advisory Services and Cyber Risk, Privacy and Data Protection at Grant Thornton, LLP. Eric, could you just tell us a little bit more about your background experience too?
Yep, certainly. And thanks for having me here. Eric Paulson. I've been with Grant Thornton for 10 years now, a lot of experience in the controls world, and as well as kind of shifting into the privacy world when a lot of people started getting interested in that space. So definitely a lot of experience working and helping individuals and organizations kind of implement their controls programs, privacy programs, whether that just be through automation or through kind of not automated methods. So just a lot of work and help getting organizations prepared and ready to be compliant with any privacy needs.
Perfect. Well, nice to meet you all. We're so excited for the program today, and I will turn it over to you all.
Great. Thank you, Jordan. So hello again, everybody. Again, I'm Rick Buck. I'm CPO of WireWheel. Today's session is practice tips for building your privacy operations. I'm on an esteemed panel with Eric and with Rebecca, who have a wealth of knowledge and experience on this topic. We're going to start the presentation off. Eric's going to take us through a couple of slides and give us his perspective on privacy operations. We'll move over to Rebecca, who will talk a little bit about it from her perspective and things that she's experienced along her career. And then we'll save room for questions at the end. If you do have questions for us, please leverage the Q&A button in the webinar, and we'll try to get to all those. So with that, I will now let Eric take the reins.
Perfect. Thanks, Rick. Just want to make sure we have time for panel questions, so I'll quickly go through my slides, 5-10 minutes, but wanted to bring up the topic of privacy assurance and really that role within privacy overall and kind of the benefits it can provide. So if we can move on to the next slide, we can really see here kind of that second line of defense model. So yep, there you go. Privacy is not going to be the responsibility of one department or function within the company. It's going to require some cross-functional collaboration and buy-in from the organization. And really the purpose of that is to sustain compliance. You're going to manage your risk. And through this second line of defense, which we're calling the privacy assurance program, I think it gives you the governance model that you can use to do that. So what exactly is privacy assurance? It's really that role and function within privacy to monitor regulations, risks. You're setting your policy and guidelines. And it's also kind of setting that framework for the internal audit team to independently assess privacy compliance on the back end. So part of this all is making sure that you're setting your distinct guidelines based on regulations, guiding the operations team, and identifying where some of those general overlaps might occur across the privacy field. So specific requirements will be changing. Those type of activities need to be documented and kept up to date with your policies and procedures. And then really even breaking that down into maybe even more separate standards to provide more context for those operations teams and internal audit. Just quickly thinking, one great example that we've actually seen a few times is around individual rights management. So GDPR and CCPA have differences in response times, GDPR giving 1 month and CCPA giving those 45 days. And if you have two different teams responding to these types of requests, you might not run into any issues. But if you have the same team responding, you might start running into an issue of, oh, I thought I was supposed to respond within the 45-day timeline, but it was actually supposed to be within 30. And that's where I'm kind of reaching to that point where breaking down some of those controls a little bit more granularly to help define what those operations teams need to do. So of course, in all of this, collaboration is going to be a key part. Working with the legal team, privacy can make sure that the organization's meeting its obligations, setting the risk appetite. You establish those roles through the framework, accountability, and leaving it up to the business to align to those objectives and provide that customer experience. And I think overall, the added benefit is really creating that communication platform to create and promote privacy by design. So if you want to move to the next slide, we kind of covered the governance structure. So how exactly are we going to set up that assurance program? And what we've come up with is more or less these 3 pillars to help you build out the framework, to monitor the function and compliance, and then setting up some of those KRIs or key risk indicators. So as we kind of look at that first pillar of privacy controls, this is really where you can leverage industry frameworks such as NIST or ISO, or just creating a custom framework. But it's going to be the base of how you can understand compliance requirements and rationalize and operationalize those requirements. This is really going to define the objectives to align with the company's risk appetite. Business users are going to be responsible for knowing how to meet those objectives. And establishes overall accountability within the organization as it relates to privacy. So I think we feel that most time the business owners don't really want to be told how to implement privacy. They kind of want to be provided with the main objectives and really work to define a process that's going to work best for them. And then once that framework is developed, obviously, they'll understand their role within compliance and can help go through those internal audit processes. The next bucket, I think, is going to be that compliance monitoring piece. And really to support ongoing compliance, it's critical that both privacy and those business operations team are continually reviewing requirements. They're continually looking at their business objectives, and one, making sure that all those controls are still operating as they once did, but 2, that the actual control objective is being met. And one way to support that is through the self-assessment process. So that's where control owners can go through and self-assess that control objective that's in place, it's still meeting the objective, but also allowing privacy to come in and assess those risks and look for more opportunities to even mitigate those risks or provide some enhancements. And I think the critical piece of this too is going to be evaluating emerging regulations. There might be changing interpretations to existing regulations. So really just using that framework to quickly identify some gaps and understand where requirements might change through the compliance monitoring function. And then the last pillar is the KRIs. So these are your key risk indicators that help you kind of evaluate the program and potentially look for those maturity opportunities. This could be number of data subject requests coming in, the number of PIAs that need to be completed, et cetera. But they really make sure that you're keeping up to date with all the privacy activities and making sure that you stay within compliance and the objectives that the organization has set. I think one good example of KRIs is mentioned the privacy impact assessments. You see the number that you need to complete trending upward. And KRIs can kind of help identify the root cause or theme. Was there a recent acquisition, so you're doing all these PIAs? Are there just a lot up for revalidation? I think having those KRIs allows the business to look at it from a broader context to figure out what they should be doing. And I think that kind of example also helps for supporting business cases and program maturity. So if we're seeing all of these increases in your data inventory or regulations, and you're having trouble getting budget, I think being able to show these KRIs can help the organization tell the C-suite why they need extra budget to cover and meet compliance objectives. So lastly, just going on to the next slide, what steps can you take? First and foremost, just understand your regulatory compliance and needs, outline your responsibilities, look forward to potential regulations, and don't hinder your program by developing a framework that is very singular. Make sure that it can be modified easily for future impending regulations. Next, identify those improvements. This is really how we embed privacy insurance, performing that kind of end-to-end gap assessment, making sure that you are identifying those gaps and then identifying roles and responsibilities. And I think one of the biggest issues we see is just overall privacy, having a seat at the governance table for part of overall organizational risk and compliance. With privacy embedded, work to improve those internal controls, operational activities, and once it's embedded, you're really kind of effectively started reducing risk through that automation piece. And then finally, prepare for that audit. Once your assurance program's up and running, you can be equipped to support any independent audit. And I know you may ask the question, I took responsibility, privacy program in a new organization. This seems like a lot of tasks to get through. I know that's one area that Rebecca is going to be covering to make sure that you kind of understand what to do within those first 90 days. So with that, I can pass it over to Rebecca to help you there.
Great. Thanks, Eric. And Rebecca, before we get started, I meant to do this at the top of the introductions. Jordan, we have a couple of polling questions that we'd love to get feedback from the audience on. So if you guys would all take a moment to respond to those. Wow, look at these results coming in. I love that the inside of 1 year is a significant. It's giving the more tenured people a run for their money. And do we have the second polling question up as well, Jordan?
That will come next. They're separate. So if you just want to read these results, and then I'll do the next one.
Okay. So how long have you been in your current role? 96 people responded to this. 19% of you have been in your new role for less than 6 months. Another 16% of you have been doing it less than a year. 18% of you 1 to 2 years. And then 32% 2 to 5 years. And some of us old folks, 5 years plus, represent about 16% of it. So it's an interesting divide between people who have been there for a long time and people who are embarking on their newest adventure in the privacy world. Very indicative of the need for privacy people all over the place and in different roles than we've seen in the past. How would you rate your maturity program, the maturity program of your organization? This is interesting feedback too. We've got over half of you have said that your program is unpredictable and reactive. Only, well, based on the polling numbers, but only 25% said that it's fully optimized and flexible. So it looks like as an industry, we have some work to do. That's great. Okay. We are now going to move over to Rebecca, who's going to talk about operationalizing and running privacy programs on a 30, 60, 90-day continuum. And Rebecca, I'll turn that over to you.
So it looks like many of you have joined the boat that I am in, which is transitioning to a new organization in the last year or so. For those, and this is helpful also for those who are looking of potentially transitioning to a new organization. We know kind of globally, this has been in the trend in the privacy space that everyone's kind of standing up and moving one chair to the left. So we thought it would be interesting to kind of talk about what those 30, 60, 90 days, although I'm not speaking on behalf of Albertsons today, I will say I just passed my 90-day mark. So I've literally just gone through this transition myself of kind of what it is to step into an organization new. And I had been at my prior job for 7 years. So it's a pretty big shift to kind of come into a new organization. With that, I think the most important thing, and it's really hard to do in the first 30 days, particularly because you're just really wanting to run, is to learn the company and the culture. And I say that because they're so much different. You know, I was somewhere for 7 years and we called everybody teammates. Well, that's not the current term. It's hard to lose. It's hard to stop calling everybody teammates. But it's not the terminology that we're using. It's not the way that we talk about one another. It's important to start to understand your business before you really start to implement change. Along that path, there are kind of two structures here that I broke this down to. You're walking in at the 30-day mark and you eat up until 30 days, and you either have an existing program or you're the first privacy person they've ever had in-house, whether you're an attorney or not. That's a pretty big shift. And so there's two mindsets that you take in that phase. For the existing team, you're listening and learning. You're trying to understand your existing team because you've likely already have people there. If you're leading a program like I am, you're getting to know them, understand what they love. And here's the really key part during this learn and listen piece is you're going to start your backlog. You're going to start to identify the little pieces and things that, oh, you know, I want to know about this, or I want to change this part of the program. You're not necessarily jumping on the change yet, right? You want to understand how to make change where it's meaningful. You're building out your brand and your persona within your organization. You don't immediately want to dive in. When you have an existing program as being someone who's kind of pushing back and maybe not understanding how the culture works with those changes, when there's no privacy program at all, my first guidance is don't panic. Like, it's okay. A lot of companies, particularly in the United States, may not necessarily have an embedded team. They may be either relying on outside counsel or consultants to fill that. When you're coming in-house, it's a big shift when there's nobody there. My recommendation from the start meeting with your cyber team, they likely have some protocol and processes that you can build on. And do build. It's really, that partnership is going to be exceptionally valuable to you. And begin to outline your crawl phase with the eye on walk. So start to think about, like, what are the basic things that you'd want in place. Now, there are some really, you know, if you're in an existing program, you probably see that there's a charter and a mission and values and all these other things. In a new program, you likely don't have those things. So start to think about what you want your program to be and how that stands within an organization, and think about the crawl phase. And obviously start your backlog. You may be in a position that you have no budget or resources when you walk in and you're the first privacy person. I would say don't have, but start to prepare for your resource discussion in those first 30 days. So moving forward to the next 60 days, this is a little bit different. This is when you're gaining momentum. People start to know you. They start to, oh, I heard someone's here. Let me understand and reach out and ask these questions. In an existing program, this is when you start to socialize your direction and gain buy-in. So you're coming in and you're saying, this is the approach we want to take. Eric was talking about what this looks like. How do you develop pieces of it that allow for changes in law? If it's 45 and 30, like, what's the way to think about this? We see all these state laws coming. You might have a particular point of view that you want to start to implement within the organization. My recommendation is start thinking through what that branding is. Obviously, you know, that's important because people are going to remember, oh, we take this type of approach in order to address change. And implement the small changes, but that have big impact, and lay the foundation for where you're going to ask and try to push forward the bigger changes. Again, you've only been there 60 days. That's not a long time. Oftentimes you're working, and a lot of you all have been at companies 5, 6, 7 years. So you have a lot of work to do to get that buy-in across the board. If you immediately come in those first 2 months and say, oh, I'm changing everything, you might not make as much progress. If you have no privacy program, start to develop your values. Who do you want to be? What kind of privacy program do you want to instill within the organization? Do you want to have a value associated with transparency and the ethical use of data? Is your company ready to embrace that concept? And how do you start to stand behind that? And this is really key when there's no program. You will become you will become impacted greatly by the success that you have, which means the more people who know you're there, the more questions you're going to have. And I can say this, you're going to have a significant number of questions. That's just the way it is. It becomes bigger and bigger and bigger the more people become aware. And that's the transition of going from there isn't a privacy program, or if there was anyone helping it, there was a resource push because it was outside counsel or consultants, but you're in-house now and they can ask you every little question. So it's fabulous because they become more aware of the program's existence, but it also means it takes up a lot of your time. So then I'm going to say the budget question, right? So you're new and you don't have budget or resources. So start capturing the metrics. Understand what's your ask. What are your time to take things? How many consumer complaints are you dealing with and having to run down? And what does this look like? And talk to cyber about their assessment numbers, because it will help you build out your metrics for, hey, I actually need a team, or I need to bring consultants in. Start to understand those things. I'm going to be honest, I'm not sure you're going to have that conversation on budget or resources within that first 60 days, but you want to be prepared. You want to start building the foundations of what your deck is going to be. And as you hit 90 days, you're going to outline your strategy. This is the point. You've been here 3 months. You are going to, if you have an existing program, you're going to have strategic planning sessions with your team. And it's really important, especially if you're leading a program. You don't want to forget that you have a team. You want everyone on the team to feel like they're building part of that success. And you build the roadmap. Now, if you don't have a privacy program, what I recommend is you do a below the line exercise, because you are going to have the entire world to handle and you can't do everything. You could work 24/7 every day of the week and still not accomplish it. So you have to do that risk evaluation. You have to balance it with what makes sense. How does it work? Outline what's possible in 6 months to a year. You're not doing a three-year roadmap. You're not ready. That's just not where your program is or where your organization is ready for you to outline it. But you can solidly outline what the bigger projects are for 6 months to a year. And if you don't have an existing technology, which you likely don't because of not having a privacy program, you're going to start to evaluate privacy technology vendors. And in the interim, as you're not there yet, you consider starting your assessments on paper prior to deploying that technology. If you have no budget or resources, start the assessments on paper. It's going to take a little bit more time because you have to get that buy-in and that funding. But plan for your future technology enhancements, because you're not going to be using Excel or Word documents for the next 20 years for these sort of assessments. You want the efficiency and the metrics and the other things that are the benefits of the technologies that you can use. And at this point, you're 90 days in, you need to be prepared for the resource conversation. It might be a few months before you feel like it's the right place to have it, but your deck for resources should be complete. You should have an understanding of, I do need a consultant for the year to get ahead. I do need this type of budget for outside counsel. And I might not be asking, quite honestly, you probably will not receive an additional FTE, within that 1 year mark. But you're having the conversation though, so that in 6 months later, and you have the deck ready, you can say, I now have, 6 months, a year's worth of metrics to show you that this isn't sustainable. And here's how we get to the next level. I want to bring in so-and-so vendor, so-and-so technology. Here's all the metrics. I want an IAPP corporate membership, whatever those things are to help build up your program. But you're really at that place where you're having that conversation. You're ready because it's going to be asked of you.
Rebecca, that was great. And Eric, thank you for your overview on this. You both touched on some really interesting topics about how to think about running your privacy program. Let's drill down a little bit deeper in some questions about some of the things that we heard. So Rebecca, I'll start with you talking about from your 30, 60, 90 perspective. And again, you touched on this a little bit in one of your slides, but day one, your company doesn't have a formal privacy program. All of a sudden, for an assortment of reasons, it's become evident to the corner office that a privacy program needs to happen. And you get tapped on the shoulder and they say, hey, Rebecca, you look smart. And we think you know something about privacy. How do you tackle this thing? What's the first thing you do? And other than take a really deep breath, what's the first thing you do? And how do you start to think about this and frame it out?
Well, I would first welcome you to the most amazing profession out there. I absolutely love data privacy and you will too, so don't panic. You're going to get there. I think the interesting phase is when you walk in, if you've been assigned, if you're new to an organization and there's no formal piece of it, is that you have to understand some of the things that are the nice to have, like a value and mission and all of those, a charter, all of those wonderful things. You can't pause to do those things because there's already implementation work that needs to happen. So you have to focus on, and you can, like, maybe you'll set aside a little bit of time for strategy, but you're not necessarily there yet. So you need to start focusing on what your tools are, what your company does, and what's the most impactful thing that you can do in the immediate to help if they, took a wrong direction with marketing or whatever those things are. You're providing that guidance. I would say that's kind of the first thing. You'll eventually work towards other pieces. The other part is, and I always joke where I work with my team, I'm always thinking about future Rebecca, whether it's myself or someone else. Every choice I'm making in those foundational first 30 days when I'm stepping into it has to think through what she's going to want. What's going to be the efficient plan? If I rush through something and I'm not thinking about efficiency, I'm redoing that work every time. So I'm trying to really, I would recommend building out the concepts that you can use in the future, because you're going to have so many questions. There's going to be so much work that you want to draft things and prepare things that allow for reuse, and think of your future self and how you leverage that.
Yeah, that's a great way to approach it. Eric, I'll ask your thoughts on this. So, beyond what Rebecca is saying, I think finding champions within the organization is key to your success. Very early on, and a long time ago in my privacy career, my good friend and mentor, Richard Purcell, who was Chief Privacy Officer at the time at Microsoft, and was my foundational privacy rock. Richard, if you're listening, hello. Introduced me to the concept of having a privacy council. And so talk about, Rebecca's established day one. At what point do you start to amass your troops, and how do you think about building a privacy council and getting buy-in from the corner office on approaching building a privacy and operationalizing even, and then operationalizing maybe down the road. But how do you think about building, building the players that are going to be your key allies within the organization?
Yep, and I think you hit the nail right on the head there. Normally, if there's not much going on, the first thing that we say is you really need to set up some sort of governance group that will be able to collaborate and know, as Rebecca mentioned, the kind of core pieces that you need to put in immediately. There are things that are nice to have, but there are you need to make sure you do put in, and that's going to require that collaboration from privacy, legal, IT, marketing, because there's no way that one or two people are going to be able to roll all these things out. It's just not an easy thing to do. Too much work has to be done across the entire organization. So, and that's kind of why we talked about the second line of defense method, is because you have this privacy function, but then you're also working with all these other groups to make sure you are operationalizing some of those core requirements. Not necessarily saying you need a full framework or you need to have those KPIs, but you need to be able to set up that governance group. You need to understand what the risk appetite is, and you need basically operationalize those important key controls in order to get the ball rolling and kind of start building out your program. And personally, I mean, if there's nothing there, that should be something that you really start, and I think it was on Rebecca's slide, day one, starting to get to know the people and the culture and everything else. And that's part of that. If there's not a very privacy-centric culture there, I think that's where she's hitting on the 60-day period is you need to kind of assert yourself to make sure that privacy does become part of that culture. And I think that can be more easily done through that governance group, setting up a champion team, and to make sure that they're pushing privacy out individually. Because if you're just hearing it from one person, one group, I don't think it has much of an impact. If you're hearing it from 5 or 6 different leaders across the board, that's where you really start having an impact, and privacy becomes a day-to-day knowledge point for all the employees in the organization.
Yeah, that's a good perspective on that. And it's interesting to see how privacy people, where privacy people are showing up in organizations now. We're seeing more and more privacy roles formally embedded in engineering teams. We're seeing more and more privacy roles embedded formally in marketing teams. So it becomes, it's become increasingly more important. Eric, I'll drill down on this just a little bit further with you. So I had talked about this on the macro level. How do you build that privacy council? But while every company's got different budgets and different sizes and different needs, how do you think about the actual privacy team itself? And how are you thinking about structuring that based on budget today, based on budget you're going to argue for down the road? What are some of the things that you're thinking about there?
Yep. So, and again, I think this points back. You don't need a framework to do this, but conceptually, I think it's a good idea to start in that direction. So first piece is identifying what are the company's risks from privacy, what are the requirements you need to meet, because when we're having those budget discussions or you're trying to determine what resources you need, if you can't show what the risks are or what requirements you need to be made, no one's going to be able to listen to you or understand why you're asking for these different things. So once you have those risks and knowledge of requirements, that's why I mentioned working with legal, understand the risk appetite. We've seen some organizations that want to make sure they're compliant with everything to as much as possible, and others that are very laissez-faire and don't want to do too much. They just want to kind of meet the very bare minimum threshold. So you might get more budget one way or the other, but understanding that risk appetite, I think is kind of that second step. Roles and responsibilities. I think that's going to be the core. Once you have all your pieces in line, you need to know who's going to do what. Privacy might be the sole operator. Centrally, everything goes through them. Or you could make sure that you do follow that second line of defense method and really push everything out towards some of those teams. And once you have that set up, you know who your teams are, you know who's responsible for what. That's when you can start developing those policies and procedures, controls, and then really start your assessment over those as well. So I think that's my kind of roadmap to operationalizing any sort of program from nothing to a good, strong, mature control set.
Yeah, I think that's great insight, and I think that's the foundation from moving privacy away from that reputation of being the Department of No and being the Department of No But, right? Like, so here's I see what you want to do. Here's how we're going to do it safely and better than the way you thought you were going to do it. But having all those pieces in place are certainly important. Rebecca, I'll riff on this just a little bit. So we've got a privacy council in place. We've got a game plan for a team. How are you? You've identified your wish. I forget your vernacular. Your wish list or your tracking list that you called it. All kinds of projects now are creeping up on the whiteboard in your office. I remember when we had whiteboards in our office, everybody. They're creeping up on the whiteboards in your office, and all of a sudden you're realizing, wow, I've got a lot to do. How are you thinking about prioritizing projects? And can you talk about that from I'm a new privacy, sort of immature privacy program versus maybe how you would think about that once you've got a little bit of traction and a little bit of inertia working in your privacy program?
So I will be honest, I don't know how many people on the line are familiar with sprint planning. I'm a big fan of a modified, so not daily tag us, but a modified sprint planning methodology that allows you to t-shirt size and understand and establish kind of what you can legitimately complete in a 2-week period. You don't necessarily track every single moment, but the larger projects and initiatives that you're trying to work through. That really helps. Where I've seen it help the most with existing programs is where you have, say, marketing gives you 6 priority 1 items and you throw it up on your sprint board and you have to go back to them and say, okay, you can't have 6 in the next 2 weeks. Let's have a conversation. What do you really need? Let me show you the breadth of work I'm doing across the business, because businesses and business units are saying like, I need this. They don't necessarily understand in particular, if you're just one person or 1 or 2 people, that you guys are covering the entire company. If you're a global company, the entire globe's worth of privacy laws. That's not insignificant, and it gives that contextual component. If you're new, I still recommend sprint planning. I do think that the agility of it really does help move the board forward. It's the whiteboard example, Rick, but of now using a technology to help with those things. But if you're new, I would also say, this is where you understand risk and you understand the business. Where is your greater risk in the privacy space? What can truly be achievable? It's having a conversation with your manager. It's the below the line, above the line exercise, right? Of prioritization of what needs to be tackled. I wouldn't recommend just doing it by yourself and having that. I recommend bringing in your manager, bringing in other people, getting the opinion and thoughts of the business so that you guys can decide what's the primary and key focus as a group. It's not necessarily a council, you'll get there, but it's not to start. This is, you're new, you don't have an existing program. You need to get buy-in for where that risk is and what things will be tackled first.
Yeah, that's perfect. So the questions that we're sort of addressing are more focused around human capital. I'm going to kind of switch gears a little bit and start to talk about technology. One question that's come up in the Q&A, and one that I think is an important one to think about, is I think certainly one of the challenges that companies have today is knowing what data they have, knowing where the data is, knowing who has access to it. And so when you're thinking about building a privacy program, how do you begin thinking about tracking down data, particularly decentralized data? And thank you, Sam, for asking the question in the Q&A. Eric, I'll start with you on this. I'm sure this is a question that comes up across many of your clients. The ever evasive where is decentralized data, and what are the things we're worried about in decentralized data? How do we manage it? How do we track it down? And technology that you're using that helps to deal with all that.
Yep, certainly. So, and there's definitely two ways to go about this. I think there's the more manual way to go about it, which I'll speak on first, and then there's the more automated way to go about it. The more manual way, I definitely think is an important piece, and it's going to involve setting up basically a workshop type of structure to reach out to different business leads across the organization, identifying who are some of the owners of processes or systems or applications, whatever it might be, and setting up time to just have an hour-long or a 30-minute discussion with them to understand, okay, what is your particular process? You have a set list of questions that'll say, okay, what systems are you using? Where are you collecting this data? How are you processing this data? Are you sharing this with any third parties? How is data retention? How is that functioning? So all of these questions you'll have lined up, and you'll have all these workshops with these different decentralized groups. And the ultimate goal of that is to create kind of that manual data inventory to meet your records of processing needs. So you're basically collecting all of that decentralized data, you're bringing it in from everyone's processes, and you're putting it into one single centralized format that would allow you to not only, one, understand where all your data is, how it's being collected, used, processed, but if there are any data subject requests that come in, I think that's going to be your source of truth. If someone says, I need to delete this data, what are you going to have to go to if you don't have that source of truth? So I think that's the more manual way to go about it. Where automation has come in and great value in this, if you're able to get the budget and resources to do so, is basically setting up that questionnaire through an automated template. You have that automated template, you understand who the particular business process owners are, and you basically send out to them saying, please complete this questionnaire so we can understand more about your process, your systems, your applications. You collect all of that in one central privacy solution, and then you're able to go through, review it, have conversations with them live to figure out if they entered something incorrectly. But then you save it, you store it, and you have that. And it's basically then, again, your source of truth to use for revalidation 1-2 years down the line when you want to go back and say, is this still processing? Are you still collecting data the same way? So I think both of them are equally good methods. Automation definitely makes things a little bit easier, but that's normally how we would recommend going about kind of identifying all that decentralized data and working with those individuals. And I guess the slight caveat there is that works with structured data. Unstructured data is definitely a completely different beast to tackle, something that we haven't seen too many organizations covering yet, but they are starting to get there. Unstructured data, definitely a different methodology. I don't want to get too much into it there, but it is an interesting topic, an area that'll definitely be coming up in years to come.
Yeah. So let's talk just a little bit more about unstructured data, Eric. Where we all use that term. Can you give some examples of the most obvious unstructured data that we never think to look for, and maybe some of the less obvious places where unstructured data might live?
Biggest one, and where we normally see most help needed is Outlook or emails or whatever you're using to process those, because there is inevitably going to be a lot of PII that's going through emails that you don't even think about. Where it could be names, it could just be Excel files that have restricted or sensitive data. They're all over your Outlook. So I think that's definitely the biggest one. SharePoints are another one. I know most groups do not set up restrictions on what you can upload, or you might not have restrictions set on who can see that data. But if you're using a SharePoint, someone uploads PDFs or Excel files or Word documents, unless you have, again, a very good automated tool that can discover and go in through each of those documents, that's basically all unstructured data. Like, you cannot understand if you have 10,000 files in one share folder, you don't know what PII is in there. And it's extremely difficult for someone to say, delete my data. How do you go into that file and say, you can't, it's almost impossible to do. So that's why it's a very interesting world when it comes to unstructured data. But those are definitely two of the big areas where I think unstructured data lies. I think one people don't think about is just your desktop. You save files on there all the time. You don't think about that being related to privacy. You're just, oh, I'm saving this, and you don't think about it in that context. So.
Yep. And Rebecca, from your point of view as a lawyer, what's the legal guidance you would give people about unstructured data?
I would say that if you don't have retention protocol and other things in places where you save, if you don't have technologies, that's something to invest in. The other thing is, it doesn't have to sit on the privacy team. There's all these other teams. You have InfoSec. Like, there are other teams that can bear the brunt of the resource expense for these things. And I will say, even for structured data, when you're talking about data mapping, there are other teams that are highly interested in that. You don't necessarily need to drive the process. They're going to want to do the automation. They're going to want to do the surveys, but also there are scanning technologies that can be leveraged and other things where your data scientists and all these other groups are really invested and interested to better understand where data sits, what the data is, how to get access to it, where then your legal team and your privacy team walk in and say, that's great, we also want to add retention. That's great, we also want to add these legal protocols. So you can also partner, and particularly where programs are totally new, you have no budget, that's when you go talk to the other people and say, what are you guys doing? What tools and technologies are you using? And how can we possibly leverage them to meet our technology needs and our reporting mechanism needs and our compliance needs? You don't have to do this all in the privacy space. You're likely not to have a large budget. That's just the reality of what privacy and privacy programs are. But there's a lot of other people within your organization that are potentially interested in this space of data mapping, who may have the investment and the ability to look at technologies. Even if it's a privacy company and a privacy technology, they may be the resource to pay for it because they want the learning.
Yeah, Rebecca, that's not the focus of today's discussion, but my experience in running privacy programs and being a senior part of other privacy programs is oftentimes, as we all know, privacy budgets are often underfunded. Going back to that initial question about a privacy council, establish your allies. Often IT has a much bigger budget than everybody else in the company. Collaborate with them and be able to leverage projects that you can work on with them to help co-fund projects that you might not have budget for. If people hear one thing that they learned today about running their privacy programs, that's certainly one. I'll ask one more question, Eric, of you on this decentralized data point of view. As you're thinking about it from data subject requests, and you mentioned SharePoint and Outlook, particularly as it relates to data subject requests, and maybe even specifically from the employee point of view. What are you seeing in terms of challenges or advice given for approaching DSAR requests, specifically as it relates to, beyond the obvious places where you're looking for data?
Yep, and great question. And I think this hits back to what Rebecca said. Setting the appropriate data retention standards and policies is going to be the most important thing you can do for that space, because unfortunately, and in the realistic pieces, most organizations are not going to be able to go and find that unstructured data and delete it at this point in time. So I think you'd be able to get by that by making sure you have the proper data retention standards in place and communicating that within your privacy notices, being transparent about how you handle data and that it's meeting those retention schedules. Because I think that's at some point what people want to hear is they want to get comfortable knowing what's being done with their data and that it's not being used unnecessarily or just staying there forever. So I think if you're not able to delete that, showing that you have this retention in place it should be enough to get you by and make people comfortable that, okay, my data is not going to be there forever. Like it'll eventually get deleted in this unstructured space. So,
Yep, thank you. So that's a great answer and touches on a question that I'll ask that came from the audience, which is talking about privacy and controls. And the question as I read this is, how can we have privacy controls for data that goes beyond the organization? That is sensitive data that gets shared with third parties and suppliers, for example. A bank can have a call center as a third-party service provider. The call center may have access to customer data. How can we control or secure that data? Rebecca, I'll start with you. Talk about power regulations. How do you think about that within your organization and advice you'd give to the audience?
Yeah, so looking at this, you obviously have the contractual piece where you're going to expect that there's going to be response to DSAR requests and the like, as well as, after the end and the termination of that agreement, you're going to request secure deletion and want some sort of confirmation so that is kind of off your table of your risk profile. For the day-to-day in this space, I would say that you want to have a guide for businesses that anyone you onboard, you want them to have an ability to, if it's appropriate, have them have an automated way for you to send deletion requests. Particularly for mature companies, they should have a way to hook into and receive. Rebecca Shore pushed out a deletion request. We're pushing it forward to you where it's appropriate, where that third party is an extension of you. It may not necessarily be appropriate control-wise to have it be third parties that have their own distinct relationship for an individual. But if this is a third party that's acting on your behalf, you want to build out the controls of this is my expectation vendor of deletion. This is my expectation of access. You want to not just contractually say that, you also want to say there are some control components of this that I want you need to respond within this number of days. I need this level of support from you. If it goes unsaid, you're allowing them to kind of make their own choices and you're not necessarily ending up, and you may have, a messy combination of manual steps you have to take for every single type of request. And that becomes, think about how many third parties that we leverage. It's not, a handful of possible manual processes. You could end up with hundreds or thousands of these just based on how your organization is built. So that is one of the implementation guides, one of the operational things. And I think Eric was referencing this as well, that you should have. You need a control document. You need to understand what is the programmatic philosophy towards this sort of thing in order to say, this is my expectation. You roll that into your RFP. You say, I need to know that you have an ability to automatically, in an automated fashion, have the ability to receive a signal to let us honor DSAR requests. What does that look like? But you're knowing going in with the vendor relationship, and that's important and an important part to the success there.
Yep, thank you, Rebecca. We're seeing that we saw that language historically, GDPR. We're seeing it now on the state level here in the United States, which is downstream accountability to your vendors. Eric, from your point of view, anything that you would add to how we think about that?
No, I think that hit on all the key points. Making sure that you're doing your ongoing due diligence with any third parties. I think that falls in that control space. Even having, I know you mentioned automation, working with them, but even having your own automated third-party management or having a system that can help you understand what organizations are doing on your behalf, what kind of data they're collecting. And I mean, there are definitely ways that you can capture the individual categories of data that are being sent to them that are going to differ from third party to third party. So I think that'll all make the process easier. And I think identifying whether or not you're the controller of that data too is the important piece, because realistically, if you're not the controller of that data, and one good example is maybe benefit providers, you need to look at that. And if you're getting those requests in and you're not the data controller, that's where you got to reach out to people and make sure that you have a process in place to make sure that they know what to do from that aspect. I think the only other thing in this space that I've seen a lot is the data transfer assessments. I don't know if it fully aligns to this question overall, but whenever you're transferring data, you need to make sure that you're doing some sort of assessment to make sure that that data transfer meets all the privacy requirements and everything that's ongoing, especially if it's involving any regional activity outside the US, specifically the EEA UK region. I think this is key as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's move in a slightly different direction. Under the pretense of if you can't measure it, you don't know if you're being successful. Eric, you referred in your presentation to key risk indicators. Rebecca, you talked about KPIs. Rebecca, I'll start with you. Can you talk about, from a KPI point of view, some of the most important things that you're tracking, and then how you're using that to make decisions about your privacy program?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I'm not sure it's necessarily all that advanced out there in the privacy industry of what those KPIs look like. Generally, I don't think there's a deeper metric beyond how many assessments you have, how many DSAR requests. It shows time. It shows how much churn there is within your organization. It might be how many high-risk systems you have, or we call them tier one, whatever those are. They help you understand and outline your resources. I don't think as an industry, we've necessarily gone to like the next level that you see in some of the other programs where they kind of have deeper insights that help feed things. But if you look at what you're churning, particularly when you start, if you start looking at how many assessments I'm doing, how many customer complaints, how many customer interactions, how many, if you have, and if you're working, if Europe has CPA reached out, what does that look? If you're tracking those sort of numbers, they're meaningful in that they can show how much work exists for your organization. It's not necessarily moving the dial externally as much, but it shows the churn and eventually the maturity of what's on your table. And at least for building the argument for resources, it shows this is why we need resources. If I'm spending 50% of my time just responding to customer questions and investigating what their complaint is, that shouldn't be my full role, right? That should probably be a small percentage, and I need a team or consultants or technology or a technology to come in and help support those things so that the time shifts. And then we're still, I think CCPA requires like how quickly did you close things out? What are the averages? Like all of those things help fund and feed your research discussion and your team structure discussion.
Yep, those are important things. Eric, KRIs, risk indicators, how are those different than some of the metrics that Rebecca was just talking about? And what are some of the, you mentioned PIAs, what are some of the other risk indicators that you're measuring against?
Yep. And I mean, I think they fall exactly same in line, different term, but you're kind of looking at the same thing, where the performance indicators is looking at the outcome. The risk indicators are really looking at maybe the input to those. So it's all going to be exact. I don't think there's anything, as mentioned, that's more important than others. I mean, maybe I'd say focus on the ones that might be a little bit more risky. And then again, every company is going to have their own risk appetite and everything else. But I think some of those consumer-facing compliance controls are going to be the ones that you should focus on if you really want to pick them. And so that's relating back to the IRM, making sure that you are getting the response, knowing the average, how many you're getting. High risk activities in your data inventory, making sure you're following those, revalidating those, and understanding to be able to respond to those IRM requests. If I had to pick two that are probably the foremost in front, that where we see most discussion around, it would be those two areas.
Yep. Great. So again, think about the things you need to measure. Think about the things that define you as successful, and then continue to look at those metrics and execute against them. We touched on this a little bit. We have California, first and foremost, that over the past couple of years has established a beachfront on state privacy legislation here in the United States. We have Colorado and Virginia coming up. We're starting to think about getting ready for Colorado and Virginia now. CPRA, we're starting to think about now. We have to think about things like rights. We have to think about things like vendor contracts. We have to think about things like doing assessments for high risk or sensitive data processing. How are you, Rebecca, I'll start with you. How are you leveraging technology to to fall into line with your current and future obligations here in the United States?
No, that's a great question. I think when you're looking at what this could be, I think there's a lot of benefit to technology to the DSAR process. This isn't something that a lot of systems, particularly when you're looking at systems that predate the US laws or even systems that predate GDPR, where some of these things are really pushed if you're a global company, having that technology resource to intake the request, to process the request, to track the request, to understand how much time until you've expired beyond that state is really important. And the other piece is the assessment work that you're talking about. So the PIA, the DPIA, all of those things in that space and the vendor assessments, having automation and conditional formatting. Every third party you're working with, and I literally mean every, is getting a form from a company. Oftentimes, if a company is not mature, and I know there was a question about kind of like if your information security program is not as mature, like how do you rely on them? There are ways to consolidate your questionnaire, and they're not necessarily every vendor on earth receiving two, one very long one from InfoSec and one very long one from privacy. Using automation allows you to use conditional formatting. Back in the day before this really existed, I was like, I just want a TurboTaxi kind of thing. I selected this and this is what I get. Technology gives you that there, and it gives the ability for these third parties to kind of quickly run through things rather than how you're sending it in Excel, how that works, right? So that really can help move forward. You can also establish, I don't know if everybody uses the term, but an IPTA, that initial privacy threshold analysis that kicks off whether or not you need everything. So maybe it's more streamlined. There's a lot of benefits to technology in operationalizing your program, but also speeding things up and making it so when you're thinking about CCPA, if you're a US company, you're thinking, if we really want to go to Europe, we're really interested in that. Now I have to do all this additional work. I haven't. The technology allows you to kind of move in a more streamlined way towards those things, as well as calculate your metrics for building out your program even more, particularly if you're looking to go to Europe and other places.
Yeah, very helpful. Eric, from your point of view, what are the 2 or 3 things that you would advise clients on to get ready for, well, CCPA, you should be ready already, but for CPRA or for Colorado, Virginia, what are the 2 or 3 things that you would say they need to be doing right away, and how might technology assist with that?
Yep. So I think the most important and first thing you should do is look at what you currently have in place and develop a roadmap. If you had CCPA and you had things in place for that, obviously you're already off to a good start. And from that point, it's identifying the differences and new necessary compliance requirements that you need to meet. So if you have nothing in place, your roadmap will be extensive. You had prepared for CCPA, your roadmap will be a little bit easier. And 3 aspects I think that we've been working the most in, HR employee data. Going to be a key function. Most people had not gone through the process of working through all of their employee data. Now that being said, it can follow the exact same process that you went through when you were understanding all of your customer data. If you wanted to create a data inventory and you had all of these workshops and data gathering sessions and needed to understand where this data is being collected, used, processed, exact same thing with HR. You have the exact same questions, exact same topic areas. You ask the people to help you out and identify how employee data is being used rather than the customer data. I think the second biggest point, which we've started to see a lot more in, is definitely data retention. I mean, this is a requirement under the upcoming regulations that you need to make sure you can address and that data is not being kept any longer than is needed. So setting up implementation guides, working with your IT teams to say, can this be automated? Do you have to go through manual bulk deletes? Like, what's the process going to look like? I think is one key aspect. And then the last is going to be security assessments and how those security assessments relate back to privacy. We're starting to see a lot more in the field, especially when it comes to breaches and everything else. Do you have the proper encryption and access controls in place? And you only solely usually think of them as an IT technical control, but in the age we're living in, they're all directly related to privacy now. So privacy needs to be involved in the inputs and outputs of those security assessments.
Yeah, this is really helpful. Thank you, Eric. I think we have time maybe for one more question. I'll take this from the audience. So the question here is wondering if anyone can speak to HR data and any trends in the area of employee privacy. Also, relatedly, how must the privacy program differ for B2B companies who don't have consumer data? What sources of PAI might be overlooked at a company like this? So employee data, B2B data. Rebecca, we'll start with you from the lawyer's point of view. You've come from a consumer background, but certainly you have employees to worry about. How are you thinking about that?
So, it's really interesting. I think this is a space where it's a little more distinct than on the consumer background, where consumer, you're maybe partnering more closely with IT. This is when you're partnering more closely with your employment counsel, because there are a lot of systems that likely will be out of scope and a lot of processes of things that you can't request to delete, right? That there's just things that a company is within an exception, right? So you have to work with people who deal with retention policies and obligations. You have to look at OSHA and other things that they might have specific things that don't necessarily go hand in hand with what you're seeing as the right piece of this. So you do want to partner very closely with your employment team.
Great, thank you. Eric, anything to add on that?
Not much. I know B2B is normally where we see kind of those more risk tolerant type of organizations that don't feel like they need to meet as many standards. But at the end of the day, I mean, you do need to meet some of them. Some of that data might be out there, might be third party related names and everything else. Not as risky, but again, you still got to go through the process. You still got to be compliant with all the regulations. So whether or not you're B2B, I mean, you still got to follow the same rules and regulations.
Yeah, great advice. Ladies, gentlemen, people of all other nomenclature, it is amazing how fast an hour goes by when you're having fun. I wish that we could continue this on for another hour. Rebecca, Eric, thank you so much for your insights and taking time out to join us on this webinar. Thank you to everybody who dialed in. I'd be remiss if I just didn't say a few words about WireWheel quickly. WireWheel is recognized by IDC MarketScape as a leader in worldwide data privacy management software. We empower companies through our trust, access, and consent platform with solutions for managing privacy notices and policies, data subject access requests, consent and preference management platforms. Our privacy operation manager platform allows companies to manage their compliance needs from everything from asset inventory to data discovery, risk assessments, vendor risk assessments and management, and privacy incident management. And so a little bit about us. I'll turn this back over to Jordan to wrap it all up. Jordan, thank you and the folks at IAPP for allowing us this hour today. I will now turn it back to you. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Yes, and of course, big thank you from us to WireWheel for sponsoring today's program so that it was free to the audience. We love working with your team, so we look forward to more in the future. I did put a link for our survey in the chat, so if you all can just go ahead and click on that. It takes about a minute or two. And the bottom of the survey that we do look at has a field where you can give us some suggestions for future topics and things like that. So we really appreciate that as well. And yeah, just thank you so much to the panel today. It was some really practical insights for everybody to take back to their teams. So we really appreciate having you. Thank you, guys.
Great. Thanks again, everybody.
Have a good one.